Okay, we're going to start today with a review of what we did yesterday and to see if any questions have come up in the minds of those who were here yesterday. And then we'll push on. We are looking for adequate reason to believe that Sinai is a real historical event, not just a myth. And we started by discussing what counts as adequate reason. How much do you need to have in the way of evidence to say that you have adequate reason to believe? And we noted that a very common thought is that adequate reason means proof. And proof means absolute infallibility. Something that couldn't possibly be wrong. Nailed down with absolute certainty. And I recommended that that's not the right standard. One shouldn't look for proof, not only with respect to Sinai, but with respect to anything. Searching for proof is the wrong criterion, it's the wrong goal. And that was for two reasons. Number one, you can't prove anything. If there's anything that contemporary philosophy agrees upon, and there's very little, the vast majority of contemporary philosophers agree that there's no such thing as a real proof. Even in math and in logic, what we present as proofs could be questionable. There are disagreements about axioms and logic in philosophy and mathematics. And certainly in any other area of life, looking for a proof is hopeless. Secondly, when you live your practical life, when you decide how to live, you never have proofs. That's not how you make decisions. You make decisions by gathering evidence, discussing it with people, and making a judgment as to which option has the best support. And since Sinai is a matter of great practical importance, the revelation at Sinai really took place, then the Jewish tradition has a real foundation. And if a revelation at Sinai didn't take place, then it doesn't have a real foundation, and that has a gigantic impact on how you live your life. So we're going to be consistent about our criteria for making decisions. We should not be asking for a proof. We should be asking for adequate reason, and adequate reason means if you consider all the available evidence, and this option is supported better than the others, then this is the one that should be selected. That was point number one yesterday. Is everybody on the page? Is everybody together with that? Okay, now, in practical application, that means when, in this series, when I'm presenting evidence, ideas, information, or in any discussion with anyone, and it occurs to you, well, let's see, he's presented all these reasons, but he could still be wrong. He could still be wrong. It's possible that he's wrong. When that thought occurs to you, the right thing to do is say, sure, he could be wrong. Of course he could be wrong. Anything's possible. Even leprechauns are possible. But the fact that he could be wrong counts for zero. Do I have any positive reason to think that, in fact, he is wrong? That would be worth considering. That has to be taken into consideration and has to be replied to. But the mere fact that he could be wrong doesn't count because it's a throwaway. Anyone could be wrong about anything. When the urge hits you to say, but maybe, remember, maybe just means it's possible. And my answer will always be, of course, maybe. But do you have any positive reason to think it's more than maybe, but real? And if you don't, then it's not going to help. So that's the criteria we're looking for. Adequate reason, which means best support given all the available evidence. Secondly, we started to look at the evidence that we can present for Sinai as a real historical event. And I pointed out that almost everything you know, or anyone knows, is based on other people's say-so. All of the events of history that took place before you were born, you know because somebody recorded it and said so. And what goes on in distant places, and the esoteric facts of science, all of them you know because you read it, somebody said so, and you took it. No one gets through life checking out everything himself. That's a fantasy. Of course, there's a lot of information, not all of it is reliable. Some of it is honestly mistaken, and some of it is deliberate lies. We have to be pretty good at navigating this sea of information, picking out what's worthy of being accepted and what isn't. Of course, even if I'm very good at picking out what's worthy of being accepted, there will be mistakes. Some things that are worthy of being accepted turn out to be wrong also. But one hopes to avoid the vast majority of mistakes. Because if I'm going to rely on information from other people and I'm not going to avoid the vast majority of mistakes, my life will be a shambles. So I better be pretty good at it. How do I learn this skill of identifying the information that's worthy of being accepted? I learn it from experience. We have lots of sources of information. We get myriads of pieces of information, and we keep score. Sometimes we get a piece of information, and we know ourselves that's not correct. So we say, okay, one failure for that source. And we keep score. If I know other people that experience has taught me are very reliable, and they tell me they've caught a source in a mistake, then I can chalk that up as another mistake. So, if you have two sources, A and B, and in my experience, I'm keeping score, A is right in the information that it gives out that we can check, and I can check, and my friends can check. It's right 92% of the time. That's a pretty good score. And I'll be inclined to trust that source on other pieces of information that I can't check. But if it's only right 60% of the time, like some sources that are sometimes loose with their criteria, then I will not trust it. It all depends upon how reliable that source is in one's experience. Again, reliability doesn't mean it's infallible. Nothing's infallible. But it's worthy of being accepted because the vast majority of the time it turns out to be correct. And this divides up subject by subject. When CNN reports the sports scores, I expect it to be close to 100% correct. When it reports its political opinions, there I'm going to be much more skeptical. Now, one step further in general terms, it's not only sources like CNN or the Encyclopedia Britannica or the local guru, which aren't equal. There's also types of sources, not particular sources, but types of sources. And I illustrated that with the idea of two people who say they witnessed a murder. Now, this murder, according to their testimony, took place when only the four of them were there: the murderer, the murderee, and the two witnesses. They say they saw it. It took place in such a way that there's no physical evidence whatsoever. So, as far as we're concerned, all we have is their say-so. How do we respond to that? People say they were eyewitnesses to a murder. Do we say, no physical evidence? We don't listen to you. We want a video. We want the dead body so we can do an autopsy. Without that, we don't listen. We don't say that. That's not what we do. It's not smart to do that either. Somebody says, you saw somebody stealing something from your house. He thinks he knows what it is. You say, no videos? I don't listen to you. No, you don't. You listen very well. And you mount an investigation. Because his saying so is evidence. But you ask yourself, who are these witnesses? What kind of people are they? Some people are known to be reliable in the reports that they give, and some people are known to be unreliable. Some types of people, age, for example. If the witnesses are 11 years old, I think we're going to be skeptical. 11-year-olds often say things that aren't reliable. We know that from our experience. So if they're 11 years old, if they say Peter killed Paul, we're not likely to put Peter in jail because two 11-year-olds said so. And if they have addictions or other psychological disturbances, or they have some benefit to gain to putting Peter in jail, so we'll be skeptical and we won't put Peter in jail. But if they're old enough and they have no psychological disturbances and they're intelligent enough, perhaps some level of education, and they don't have anything to gain, then we know from experience that people like that, when they give testimony, and later on we can find out whether it was true or false, almost always is true. That being the case, we're going to trust these people, even though we can't test them on other occasions. But we know they're in a category of people, and the category of people is reliable, so we'll trust them because they belong to the category. And we'll put Peter in jail. And again, I want to stress, we're talking about they're giving testimony for which we have no other evidence. No one is going to say, well, you only have eyewitnesses and no other evidence. We dismiss that. Just eyewitnesses don't count. They do count when the eyewitnesses are reliable. Are we together so far? This we all did yesterday. Okay. Now, the question is, who are the witnesses, or what is the source of information that delivers Sinai? The type of source of information is this. Nations have traditions about their own past. Sometimes, maybe this is rare, sometimes the tradition describes something that happened to the nation in the past, where what it describes is an experience. Something happened to the nation as a whole. Every man, woman, and child in the nation experienced it. So, for example, the tradition says there was a war. If it describes being defeated in the war, in ancient times especially, that meant everybody knew about it, because defeat meant the victorious army invaded and burned down the houses and raped the women and looted the coffers and set up taxes for the future time. Everybody knew about it because each person in the group experienced it directly. Sometimes the victory is that way, sometimes it isn't. Migration, or a pestilence where a disease ravaged the entire country, like the Black Death in Europe, where in 10 years, 30% of all Europe died. Everyone in Europe knew about that directly. They didn't hear about it from somebody else. Everybody knew about it. Or a technological invention which spread throughout the group. Everybody saw them, witnessed them. When you have a national tradition like that, the question is, how reliable are traditions like that? Each tradition is a source of information. It's the category of such traditions that I'm considering. I call these NETs, National Experiential Traditions. That means a national tradition that describes a national experience. And I want to know how reliable traditions like that are. Now, notice, I'm not talking about Jews or Judaism or Sinai or Hebrew or Revelations. I'm talking about Egyptian traditions and Assyrian traditions and Roman traditions and Greek traditions and Nigerian traditions and Chinese traditions and Eskimo traditions. I'm talking about worldwide cultures. I'm talking about throughout the history that we have recorded. I'm talking about the reliability of this particular type of tradition. Of course, there are many traditions that are not correct. Many traditions record things that didn't happen. The question is whether there are any national experiential traditions that record things that we know didn't happen. And I tell you, on the basis of my historical research, there isn't a single example of a national experiential tradition that we know is false. Not one. Some we can't check. Not everything historically can you check. But of all the ones that we can check, traditions about wars, traditions about migrations, traditions about inventions and so forth and so on, all the ones that we can check turn out to be true. That means this category of information, national experiential traditions, worldwide, mankind-wide, is a category that, so far as we know, people don't make mistakes. People make lots of kinds of mistakes in lots of kinds of situations, but not every kind of mistake in every situation. And this is the sort of mistake that we have no record of any group ever making. Well, the revelation at Sinai was delivered by such a tradition. Our tradition has had the revelation at Sinai as a mainstream, a universal belief for thousands of years. And if you look into the Torah itself, it says that every man, woman, and child heard God speak. If you have the image of Moses going up on a mountain and coming down and telling them what God said, that image is true for a lot of material. But for the 10 pronouncements at Sinai, it's not true. They all heard God speak. So the tradition is a tradition of our nation, and it's a tradition about our ancestors, and it's a tradition about our ancestors having an experience, and the kind of experience you would expect people to remember. That means it fits into the category of national experiential traditions, and therefore the experience of all mankind with traditions like that gives me positive evidence that our tradition is correct. If you ask, well, where's external confirmation for it? Where are other nations that have records of it? I say, let's go back to Peter killing Paul. The point of this is to trust testimony where you don't have any other evidence. That's the point of the exercise. That the testimony itself is evidence if the testimony comes from a source that you have every reason to believe is accurate. Every reason to believe is certainly fulfilled when every case of this type you've tested has turned out to be correct. There isn't a single counterexample. So it seems to me that we have a national experiential tradition. It's something which everyone experiences, something that people will remember, and therefore we have every reason to believe that it is correct. Could it be wrong? With all of the evidence of no one we know ever making a mistake, could it be wrong? The answer, of course, is yes, it could be wrong. It could be wrong. It's possible that it's wrong, but we don't live our lives on possibilities. We live our lives on probabilities. We live our lives on probabilities. If all the experience of mankind is these traditions are correct, the probability is that this one is correct. That's what we did yesterday. Are we together? Yeah. Tremendous. Now, I want to explain to you an attack which this exposition always engenders. There's a standard attack. And I hope to show you that I can go back through the way I presented it and show you that I've already planted the seeds against the attack. But it's worth spelling out because the attack always comes up. What are you telling me, Rabbi? You're telling me you got this tradition and it couldn't be wrong? I can think of a dozen ways in which traditions like that could go wrong. First of all, let's suppose the people believe that their priests have supernatural powers. And let's suppose one day that the priests feed the people mescaline and they're in a psychedelic state. And they're dancing around the fire. And there's drums beating in the background. And the priests chant, there was a revelation, there was a revelation, there was... I can imagine them getting hypnotized and sort of coming out and saying, oh, wow, look at that, there was a revelation. I can easily imagine that. What's so difficult about that? Or the king wants to change history, so he kills all the history teachers, and he puts his soldiers in as history teachers, and he teaches the kids a brand new history. So when these kids grow up, then these kids think that that's the real history. Or, less fanciful, what the academics will tell you, there's something called myth formation. Myth formation. Anthropologists talk about this, historians talk about this, sociologists talk about this. How does myth formation work? You have a group of people, and something happens. Now, this something might be surprising to them, unanticipated by them, unexplainable by them. Let's say a tsunami. They've never seen anything like this before. They've never heard of something like this before. The sea rises up to 100 feet and smashes into the shore. It makes an impression. Of course, they tell the children, tell the grandchildren, the story gets repeated. Now, the story gets repeated over time. Second generation, third generation, fourth generation. Do they tell the story with extreme accuracy? Do they repeat every detail in the same way every time? No. People's minds drift, and they perhaps extrapolate a little bit and maybe add some embellishments to the story. Imagine it's going on for hundreds of years. The story can evolve and change considerably. Indeed, according to these people, it's easy to imagine that the story changes from the story of a natural event into the story of a supernatural event. And additions get added. Why did the water strike the shore? Because we have a lousy society, because we did something to anger the gods. 3 generations later, and when it smashed into the shore, it said, evil, 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 to convince us that we were evil. And then 3 generations after that, it came with more information. You can imagine the story changing and growing and developing this way. Once you understand that myth formation is a process that takes place, and I agree it takes place. Everyone agrees that it does take place. So you can easily imagine it taking place in a case like this. Why do you think that your tradition couldn't be wrong? Is the attack clear? Okay, now I used a few words in expressing the attack that ought to give it away. What words did I use? Anybody pick up? Couldn't. He's asking, why couldn't it be wrong? I used another word. How about imagine? Can't you imagine that it went wrong? My answer is, of course it could be wrong. And of course, it's easy to imagine that it's wrong. You can imagine all sorts of things. The Red Queen imagined 5 impossible things before breakfast every day, right? In Alice in Wonderland. Right? Mm-hmm. The fact that it could be wrong, the fact that you can imagine that it's wrong, just means that it's possibly wrong. I gave that away. To have any traction against us, the critic has to show not that it's possible wrong, but that it's probably wrong. How's he going to upgrade his comment from possible to probable? He says, I have a scenario, gradual development of stories, And I claim that that scenario accounts for your tradition. It didn't happen. There was no revelation. I claim that the scenario accounts for your tradition. And I claim that that accounting is probable. Not just possible, but probable. I think we have a right to ask him, why do you say it's probable? What evidence do you have that it's probable? You can't just say that it's probable. You need some evidence to show that it's probable, more than just possible. The very least that he needs is to show that his scenario works sometimes. Sometimes. Let's say in the whole history of mankind, it worked 4 times. If he could show us 4 examples where his scenario of myth formation gradually produced a false story, which is believed by the whole nation, then we could say, look, it happened to the Indonesians, and it happened to the Greeks, and it happened to the Polynesians, and it happened to the Los Angeles. I mean, that's another nation. And since it happened those 4 times, it's probable it happened in your case also. So let's ask, can he do that? Can he give us any examples where his scenario has actually produced a false NET? No, he cannot. He cannot give us any such examples. Why not? Because, as I told you, there are no known false NETs at all. There are no known false NETs. So, if there aren't any known false NETs, it follows that you can't find me a case where his scenario produced a false NET. He hasn't got any false NETs to work with. So the critic is between a rock and a hard place. The critic, if he's all he's going to say is that it's possible, then we're going to dismiss him and say, sure, it's possible, so what? And if he says it's probable, we're going to ask for evidence. The evidence has to be places where his scenario works, and it's never worked so far as we know. It's never worked to do this, to produce a false NET. Myth formation works to produce all sorts of other false beliefs, but not false NETs. If that's the case, then he has no way to claim that what he's suggesting is probable, and if not, he has no traction against us. Are we together? Yeah.
Do Christians claim that they saw Jesus walk on water?
Question is, who's they? We're talking about a national experiential.
National?
No, it isn't.
I don't know who. I don't know the story.
Okay, so I'll tell you what the story is. I mean, it's a relevant question.
Imagine there was a group of people at least that saw this.
Sure, they have the numbers. They actually have the numbers. In their books, of course, the story occurs several times in different places with different numbers. The largest number is 5,000.
It's pretty national.
Really? It's really national? You're talking about in the area of ancient, 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem and in Israel, in which the population was millions of people. And the local population was tens of thousands of people. You're talking about a small minority of the people. And none of them are mentioned by name. None of them. That's the loaves and fishes. And walking on the water, I don't know if there are numbers there. There's a number for the loaves and fishes. There's a number for the resurrection that people saw, about 500 people saw. But it makes no difference. It's certainly not a national claim. And there is no nation that has a national claim. It's a tiny minority of the local population. And why is that important? I'm coming to the last point that I made yesterday, and they're directly relevant to what you said. Someone will ask, look, you made up this category, national experiential tradition, and you showed that they all are reliable in this way. Who said that's an interesting category? Maybe you just made it up so it'll work. I don't think that's a serious critique. Okay, isn't science in the business of making up criteria that'll work, making up concepts that work? I think that's what science does all the time. But leave that aside. The way I arrived at this category is a suggestion in a book called The Kuzari, and the suggestion is made as follows. Imagine making up such a story. You come to a group of people and you say, boy, have I got news for you. Let me tell you what happened to your ancestors 300 years ago. All of your ancestors were together and PQR happened. What are the people in the audience going to say? They're going to say, what? This happened to our ancestors? How come nobody knows about it? You're talking about something cataclysmic. Talking about a revelation from God, or an earthquake that wiped out 90% of the population or something. No one knows about it but you? This is not the sort of thing that people forget. That's what I call the audience challenge. Now, I said this yesterday, and it's very important to get clear on this. The audience challenge is just to identify what kind of story we're talking about. The audience challenge is not the grounds for believing the story. It's the identify what kind of story we're talking about. The grounds for believing it is the empirical survey. Let's go through that in detail. The story I'm talking about that's going to be reliable is a story which, if you tried to convince someone about it, you'd fail because, you think you'd fail. It's a natural assumption that you would fail because he'll ask you, how come we don't know about it? That's my intuition. I said yesterday, suppose somebody doesn't share that intuition. You think they'd ask? You think they'd be worried about the fact? I don't think so. I think you could sell it to them anyway. So then it's intuition against intuition. I don't see any way to prove that my intuition is better than theirs just on the basis of what? The force of my intuition? I don't see any reason any way to distinguish between the two intuitions. That's why I did the empirical survey. Let's see in history whether these things go wrong. The real reason for accepting it is that we have no examples of NETs that have failed. That's the real reason. But if you ask me, why did I pick NETs? Because they have this intuitive characteristic that it would be hard to sell it. I think everybody agrees it would be hard to sell it. There would be a barrier there. How come we don't remember it? The only question is whether the audience can get over the barrier. Yeah, we don't remember it, but still, he's very persuasive. So let's ignore that. Everybody realizes that there's a barrier there. The question is, how strong is the barrier? I say the barrier is absolute. No one will jump over the barrier. Somebody else says, no, it's not absolute. I think that audiences can jump over the barrier. So now the question is to test how strong is the barrier. The empirical survey shows that the barrier is really absolute. No one, so far as we know, has ever jumped over this barrier. So the kind of story we're talking about is a story where, when you tell it to the people, they're going to say, how come we don't know about it? Because you're talking about our whole ancestry. Now let's imagine someone making up this story, the Christian story, 80 years later. Somebody comes to a group of people and says, 80 years ago, our mentor went out into a park and walked on the water or gave out loaves of fishes or something else. Really, who was there? 3,000 people. 5,000 people. Who were they? No names. Don't know. The person in the audience is supposed to say, oh, if that really happened, I would surely know about that. Why would he? It's 2% of the population. Why would he know about it? If it happened to 2% of the population, there's no reason to think that he would know about it. Indeed, a fellow named Huston Smith, who wrote a classic called Religions of Man, who himself is a Christian, but he wrote well about Judaism. I was shocked when I read that. So I said, if he can get Judaism right, he probably got Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam right also. I did other research, but it's a good book. He says, if all Christianity had to go on was the miracles performed by the founder of Christianity, it would have certainly died out. That's not how he gained his credibility. Because he says there were dozens of miracle workers at that time, and they all did miracles and everybody knew about them, and they just died out. It isn't miracles that turned the trick. He's writing that about his religion and its history. So it's not the religion, it's not the miracles that did it. People were known to have reputations of doing miracles, and most of the people took it with a grain of salt, or a teaspoonful of salt, or a shovelful of salt, and they managed to remain unaffected by it. So it's crucial that it's a national story, because if it's about the nation, then the audience has to say, why didn't I hear about it? If it's 2% of the population, then maybe the chain of information just didn't get to me. But if it's national, then it's got to be that it would come down. That's the barrier. And then you have the difference of intuitions. Can you jump over the barrier? You can't jump over the barrier. And the historical survey shows that you can, indeed, cannot jump over the barrier. That's what we did yesterday, and that's not so brief summary. We're all together? Yeah.
So in the case where God came down, spoke to them, 40 days later they're already praising another idol, didn't they already forget about the situation that happened? And
very good question. What about worshiping an idol, the golden calf, a mere 40 days later? That's a bomb of a question. The answer to the question is, it wasn't an idol. And the explicit verses read literally show you that it wasn't an idol. Now I have a whole share on that. It's recorded. You can listen to it. But the verses themselves say that it wasn't an idol. I'll just tell you one, verse 5 there. After he makes the calf, the golden calf, he says to the people, tomorrow we're going to celebrate. And he says it will be a celebration to the Jewish God. He uses the name Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey, the proper Hebrew name of God. If he's announcing that they're going to celebrate to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the God of Moses, that's not an idol. There are many other elements in the literal reading, but that, I think, seems to me, is already damning for that idea that it was an idol. If he's telling you to celebrate to the Jewish God, it can't be an idol. What it is, you can listen to my shir online, and you can get it in detail. At any rate, so it wasn't that. Had it been national idol worship, I'd have been with you. Okay. But the verses just don't say that. Yeah.
Do you trust people? However long ago was? How long ago was this? 3,000 years?
Yeah.
Do you trust people 3,000 years ago when they start talking about magic?
I don't trust people at all. I use my experience to determine when they're reliable and when they aren't reliable.
Right, so your point is, do you believe Jesus walked on water?
I don't believe Jesus walked on water because I don't think we have any reason to think that it really happened.
Right, so as in the people that believe this kind of stuff, the people that were starting these kind of religions up, if you believe that, they believed all this kind of magic and stuff. As in, so do you think that these kind of people that believe in this kind of magic are trustworthy enough for us to be able to then take their word for it, that whether it's a nation or not a nation, whatever, are these people trustworthy enough to actually be acceptable?
Again, you use the word trustworthy as if it were a matter of treating them as morally competent or not. I'm not interested in morality. I'm not interested in whether good people are bad people. I just want to know what track record do they have
I'm talking about trustworthy in terms of these guys believed in magic. Why? As in, you don't. If someone believes in magic, you ignore them.
I trust them when they say they believed in magic. I trust them about that. You're asking me whether I trust that the magic is real? No, I don't trust that. But then they weren't competent to judge that. So.
No, but my question is rather as in so fine. So they say they hear God speak.
Right.
As in, do you trust them? You take them. You say fine. That's what you heard. That's what happened there. You trust them.
Okay. So now maybe we're getting to a question that's directed to what I'm saying. As I said at the outset, as I said yesterday, the goal here is to show that the event at Sinai is a real historical event, not just a made-up myth, not something that didn't happen. Now you can ask, what happened? What exactly happened? And how much of the description were they competent to give testimony to, and how much were they not? That's an interesting question. You have to go through exactly how they described it and ask, how much of it was just describing what they experienced, and how much of it was drawing conclusions from what they experienced. If they say that they were spoken to by the creator of the universe, I can't trust them for that. I can't trust them for that. How would they know it's the creator of the universe? How would they identify that? It'd be very difficult to understand that. But if they say the whole mountain was on fire, and the ground was shaking under our feet, and there was smoke and cloud of the sound of the shofar, they're describing their direct experience. And that I can trust them for because, as I said, we don't have a single example of an NET that we know is false. So if this is an NET, all human experience indicates that traditions of this kind are true.
Where's that written?
In the book of Exodus. Chapters 19 and 20. Yeah.
The other NETs you were talking about, they were more over a long period of time, so like national wars, the civil rights movement, different NETs that are corroborated by entire nations, but they happened over periods of time. Well, this one's talking about it happened on a day, God came down, he spoke to the people, it happened all at once. Are there other examples of other NETs that are similar?
That's a very interesting question. In all the years that I've been teaching this, no one has asked that question before. But I will add in something that I usually add in as a footnote, and that is, this argument applies to the plagues in Egypt. It applies to the crossing of the Red Sea. It applies to the manna that they ate every day. It applies to the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. So it means there's a long-standing process, all public in the same way, that would make it into not just a single event. But that's an interesting point. I haven't put that in before. It's worthwhile putting in. Yeah.
Could someone say an event like the 9/11 would be a national experience that happened on a singular event, and that would be that cause like that?
I would say 9/11 could be. It's just a little bit of a slip, but I'm inclined to credit it. After all, we're talking about a national experience. Are we talking about the American nation? Most of them saw it on television. Right? So, if you count television, I would say Tiananmen Square was not a national event because what happened there when the Chinese army murdered the students is not what the Chinese people were shown on television. What they were shown on television was phony pictures of the students charging defenseless students charging guns. And, so I'm that may be borderline in that respect. But considering what we know about national reporting in the United States and all the rest of it, yes, it could be a kind of national experience. I agree. Now, there is an objection that I want to briefly at least raise for you and indicate how I will respond to it. And that is all the NETs that I'm using as my background are NETs about natural events. I'm now claiming credibility for an NET that describes a miracle. There's a gap there. There is an expression which goes back to Carl Sagan, of whom I am not a fan, who said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And while that's very vague and very hard to pin down, there is a sort of intuition there. I just had an email now from somebody who misunderstood it, where because the claim is extraordinary, we think we have background evidence against it, so you need positive evidence to counteract that background evidence. I think that's reasonable. How can we claim support from NETs that describe natural events or an NET that describes a miracle? And in order to answer that, I think we need to explore how hostile is it reasonable to be to miracles? What is reasonable hostility to miracles? First of all, what is a miracle? How do you define it? And then how reasonable is it, how hostile is it reasonable to be against miracles? I think that people have an exaggerated picture of how hostile one should be or could be to miracles. Let me just start taking you down the road. A miracle is an event that what? Breaks the laws of nature, let's say. Okay. So now, you're sitting and you're considering, was X a miracle or wasn't X a miracle? So you're going to say, let's see, does X violate the laws of nature? Which laws of nature? Which ones? Well, you're living in your time, so I suppose it means the laws of nature that your science, your experience has delivered to you. You're checking that event against your picture of laws of nature. Now, let's imagine someone who preaches absolute hostility. No miracles for me, not even after the third beer. No miracles, period. Okay. Now, somebody says he saw Q. He says, wait, let's check. Q? Here are my laws of nature. This one rules it out, so it couldn't have happened. How will he ever learn that his picture of the laws of nature isn't correct? How will he ever make progress in science? Doesn't it happen when the laws of nature say one thing, something else happens, it doesn't fit, we say, okay, so maybe the laws are wrong. A person who is absolutely hostile to miracles has painted himself into a corner where he can't make scientific progress. That's probably not a good position to be in. So then a person has to rethink, how hostile can I afford to be when somebody claims something happened that violates the laws of nature that I have in front of me, the ones that my time, my culture, my society, my age thinks are the real laws of nature. So then it can't be an absolute hostility. So what kind of hostility can it be? Well, this thing is going to be usually very unusual. Very unusual. And the course of our experience, it seems to follow patterns, and this is going to break the patterns. So we want to have some good evidence that the patterns have been broken. But we're not going to rule it out in principle. David Hume, who went down this path, at least some think he went down this path, there was a whole parody of him in the 19th century saying that if I follow your suggestions that unusual events can't be accepted, then most of European history can't be accepted. Napoleon grew up, became an emperor of France, all by himself, fought the whole of Europe to a standstill. What's the probability of that? 0. So therefore, I shouldn't expect any reports on it because it's very unusual. And according to that kind of strict adherence against things which are unnatural, most of history would go down the drain. So the question is, how much testimony do I need to change my picture of how the world works, to change my picture of what the laws of nature are? And here I have a few examples. A couple are fanciful and a couple are real. The ancient Chinese kept star charts, very detailed star charts. And in fact, they observed a couple of nova explosions because one night they come out and they say, hey, where that dot is, brighter than usual. A few months later, it disappears. So they made a record of it. Now imagine a visit from Greece. In Greece, the law was, the teaching was, the philosophy was, the science was, the heavens never change, period. They never change, period. The philosophers said, heavens aren't made like the earth, they're made out of, you've heard the name quintessence? Quintessence means the fifth essence. Everything in earth is made of combinations of 4 elements. The heavens are made of some 5th thing, which never changes. Now he goes to China and he visits the people. And he's talking to them, staying for some months, investigating their culture, and he finds these star charts. He says, what is this? Piece of paper with dots all over it. That's a picture of the stars. Really? They don't do that in Greece. Really? Comes out at night, looks at the chart. By golly, look at that. Dots, stars, very detailed, very interesting. One night he's looking at the star chart, looks at the sky, and he sees a dot on the chart which isn't in the sky. So he calls his Chinese friend, he says, oh, you see? You guys aren't so careful, you made a mistake. Here you put a dot and there's no star there. So the Chinese fellow looks at it and says, hey, that can't be. We never make mistakes. That's not, oh, he says, let's turn it over. We'll have the date of the chart on the back. Oh, this chart was made 22 years ago. There used to be a star there and there isn't now. What's the Greek going to say? What have you been drinking or sniffing or injecting? Stars don't change. Nothing in the skies change. Nothing in the skies can change. So Plato taught. So Aristotle taught. So Socrates taught. It can't happen. Could the Greek come to doubt his Greek science? Could he not say, look, these guys make these charts. We don't do that. We're not interested. They stare at the sky and they talk about the sky, the whole cast of people who are chosen to do this at government expense. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. And notice, this isn't repeatable. You can't repeat nova explosions at will. He's just trusting their testimony that something happened which is going to cause him to change his whole picture of how the heavens work. I think that's quite credible. I think it's quite credible. Because they're trustworthy. Because he knows they're careful people. That's enough to change your picture of how the world works. That means that we're not rationally committed against miracles. The question is, how good is the testimony? Well, Sinai comes from a source of testimony that has never been known to make a mistake. It has a perfect record. I think that's as good as Chinese star charts. Okay, have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you again on Sunday.